I remember the exact moment I stopped being a person in my own home. It was a Tuesday morning, a gray, unremarkable Tuesday in November, the kind of day that blurs into all the others when your life has shrunk to the size of a kitchen. I was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal that nobody had asked me to make, but that everyone expected to be there, hot and ready, by 7:15. Gerald was at the table, reading the news on his tablet, his coffee steaming beside him. His mother, Eleanor, was sitting across from him, already dressed in her good blouse, the lavender one she wore when she wanted to remind everyone that she came from a certain kind of family. And I was at the stove, stirring. No one looked up when I set Gerald's bowl in front of him. No one said thank you when I refilled Eleanor's coffee without being asked. And when I finally sat down with my own cup, Eleanor looked at me, really looked at me, the way you look at a piece of furniture you're considering replacing, and said, "Sandra, the baseboards in the hallway need wiping. I noticed them yesterday." Gerald didn't look up from his tablet. I said, "I'll get to it today." And that was it. That was the moment. Not because it was the worst thing she'd ever said to me. Not because it was the cruelest or the most humiliating. But because I realized, sitting there with my cup of coffee, going cold, that I had said those exact words, "I'll get to it today," so many times that they no longer even registered as language. They were just a sound I made, a reflex. Like a dog that's been trained to sit. I was 58 years old. I had been married to Gerald Whitmore for 31 years. I had raised 2 children in that house, cooked thousands of meals, washed mountains of laundry, attended every school play and every holiday gathering, and every Sunday dinner with a smile on my face and a casserole in my hands. I had been a wife, a mother, a daughter-in-law, a hostess, a cook, a cleaner, a scheduler, a peacekeeper, a silence keeper. What I had never been, in that house, was seen. But here is what none of them knew, not Gerald, not Eleanor, not my son Patrick or my daughter-in-law Renee. Not a single person sitting at that breakfast table, or anywhere else in the Whitmore family orbit. I had a secret. And that secret was about to change everything. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start in that kitchen. It starts much earlier, in a small town in western Pennsylvania, in a house that smelled like pine wood and motor oil, with a man who spoke very little, but meant everything he said. My father's name was Robert Calloway. Most people who knew him would have described him as quiet, unassuming. A man who drove an old pickup truck and wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation and never talked about money, because, as he used to say, talking about it doesn't make it grow. He ran a small auto repair shop for most of his adult life. And then, when I was in my early 20s, he sold the shop and bought land. Not fancy land, no one would have called it fancy. Acres of unremarkable terrain in 2 different counties. Purchased quietly, without fanfare, at a time when no one was paying much attention to that part of the state. People paid attention later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. When I was growing up, we were comfortable, not wealthy comfortable. My mother drove a sensible car and bought clothes on sale and made her own bread because she liked to, not because she had to. My father was the kind of man who fixed things himself, who didn't waste, who planned quietly and acted deliberately. He was not a flashy man. He was not the kind of man you'd look at and think, that man has something. But he did. He had vision. He had patience. And he had a lawyer named Harold Finch, who had been handling his affairs since before I was born and who understood, better than almost anyone, the depth of my father's quiet ambitions. I was an only child. My mother passed when I was 19, a stroke, swift and devastating, and after that it was just the 2 of us, my father and me, until I met Gerald at 26, and the shape of my life began to change. My father liked Gerald well enough, at first. Gerald was handsome and confident, and worked in finance. And there was something about his certainty, the way he walked into a room like he already owned it, that I found compelling at 26, in a way I would come to find exhausting at 46. My father saw something in Gerald that I think I chose not to see. He never said anything directly, that wasn't his way, but I remember, the week before my wedding, he sat me down at the kitchen table and said something I have thought about nearly every day since. "Sandra," he said, "a man who makes you feel small is not a man who loves you. He's a man who's afraid of you." I thought he was being overprotective. I thought he was just a father, struggling to let go of his daughter. I kissed his cheek and told him not to worry. I wish I had listened more carefully. Gerald and I married in June. We moved to Ohio, where Gerald's family was, where his mother Eleanor held court like a small and tyrannical queen over a kingdom that consisted primarily of her son's attention and whatever room she happened to be standing in. I had known Eleanor before the wedding, of course, had met her several times, had smiled through her pointed comments about my simple background and her careful way of mentioning, always in passing, always with a sweet smile, that Gerald had dated a girl from a very good family before me. A girl whose father was a doctor. A girl who had gone to a better school. I should have understood then what kind of marriage I was walking into. But I was in love, and love, when you are 26 and wearing a white dress and your father is sitting in the front row with tears in his eyes, feels like enough. It feels like more than enough. It feels like everything. It wasn't. The first years were not terrible. That's the thing about this kind of life. It doesn't start terrible. It starts with small things. A comment here, a dismissal there. Gerald forgetting to mention my opinion in a conversation, and then, when I brought it up later, looking genuinely confused, as though it hadn't occurred to him that I might have one worth sharing. Eleanor arriving unannounced on a Wednesday and rearranging my kitchen cabinets while I was picking up the kids from school. And when I came home to find everything moved, saying brightly, "I just thought it made more sense this way, Sandra, you'll thank me." I didn't thank her, but I didn't say anything either. That was the pattern. That was the architecture of my life in that house. Gerald made decisions about money, about vacations, about what car we drove, and what neighborhood we lived in, and I made dinner. Eleanor expressed opinions about everything from the thread count of my guest bedroom sheets to the appropriateness of my haircut, and I smiled and said, "You're probably right," and then went into the bathroom and pressed my hands flat against the cold tile of the counter until I felt steady again. We had 2 children. Patrick, born when I was 29, who grew up to have Gerald's jaw and, I came to understand slowly and with great sadness, Gerald's particular way of not quite seeing me, and Diane, born when I was 32, who was softer than her brother, more careful, who sometimes caught my eye across the dinner table in a way that told me she noticed more than she let on. The children grew. The years passed. My father visited when he could. He wasn't the traveling type, but he came for Christmases and the children's birthdays, always arriving with modest gifts and that quiet steadiness that I had grown up taking for granted and now recognized as something rare and irreplaceable. He never said anything critical about Gerald in front of me again. But he watched. My father was always watching when he called me every Sunday, without fail, every Sunday at noon. For 31 years we talked about the children, about the garden, about a book he was reading or a repair he was doing on the old truck. We talked about everything and nothing. And sometimes, at the end of the call, he would say, "You doing okay, Sandra? You taking care of yourself?" And I would say yes, and he would be quiet for a moment, and then say, "Good. That's the most important thing." I understand now what he meant. I understood it even then, somewhere underneath the layers of routine and resignation, and the daily performance of a woman who had made her peace with things. But understanding something and doing something about it are 2 entirely different acts, and I was not ready, not yet. The ready part came later. My father passed away 4 years ago, on a cold morning in January, in the house where I grew up. He was 81 years old and he went in his sleep, which was exactly the kind of exit he would have chosen, quiet, uncomplicated, on his own terms. I flew back to Pennsylvania alone. Gerald had a work thing he couldn't move. Patrick sent flowers. Diane called me every day for a week. her voice tight with the specific grief of a grandchild who has lost the last of that generation. And I held the phone and cried in ways I hadn't cried in years. Harold Finch called me 3 days after the funeral. Harold was 74 by then, semi-retired with an office above a dry cleaner's on Main Street that smelled like pressed wool and old paper. I had known Harold my whole life. He was the kind of lawyer who came to birthday parties and knew your mother's name and remembered that you liked lemon cake. He was not a fancy lawyer. But he was. I came to understand, sitting across from him that January afternoon, an extraordinarily thorough one. Your father asked me to go through all of this with you personally, Harold said, setting a folder on the desk between us. He was very specific about that. I remember looking at the folder. It was thick. Thicker than I expected. He was also very specific, Harold continued, folding his hands, that this conversation remain private. Between you and me, and the relevant legal documentation. He had his reasons, Sandra. Strong ones. I nodded, not entirely sure what I was nodding at. Harold opened the folder and began to explain. It took 2 hours. By the end of it, I was sitting very still in that chair above the dry cleaners on Main Street, with my hands folded in my lap and my heart doing something complicated in my chest. And I understood, for the first time fully, completely, with no room left for doubt, what my father had been doing all those quiet years. The land he'd bought in his 30s had appreciated in ways that even Harold described, with characteristic understatement, as significant. There were investments, careful, patient, long-horizon investments, managed with the same unhurried deliberateness my father brought to everything. There was a property in Virginia that had been in a trust since before I was born. There were accounts I had never known existed, in institutions I had never heard of, accruing quietly for decades. And all of it, every acre, every account, every asset, was mine. My father had left everything to me, his only child. And the estate, when Harold walked me through the numbers in his careful, steady way, was worth just over $4 million. I sat very still for a long time. Then I said, Harold, I need you to help me understand how to keep this private. Harold looked at me for a moment. He had known me for 54 years. He had known my father for longer. He understood things without being told them. I had a feeling you might say that, he said, and he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a second, thinner folder. Your father had a feeling too. I drove back to Ohio 2 days later, with a plan already forming in my mind. Not a dramatic plan, not a revenge fantasy, something quieter and more patient than that, something my father would have recognized. I said nothing, to no one. Gerald asked how the estate had settled and I said, there wasn't much, just the house, which I've asked Harold to handle. The house was true, Harold was handling the sale of my father's house. And those proceeds were real, modest, and accounted for. Everything else remained exactly where it was, in accounts Gerald didn't know existed, managed by a lawyer in Pennsylvania who had never once, in 40-plus years of practice, violated a client's confidence. I went back to the stove, back to the baseboards, back to the Sunday dinners and the quietly ignored opinions and the life I had been living. But something had shifted. When Eleanor criticized the way I'd arranged the living room furniture, I smiled and felt, underneath the smile, underneath the familiar resignation, something new. Something I can only describe as stillness. The stillness of a woman who knows something no one else in the room knows. The stillness of a person who has options. Options change everything. Not the exercise of them, just the having. Just knowing that the door exists. Even if you're not ready to walk through it yet. I wasn't ready yet, but I was watching, and I was waiting. And for the first time in a very long time, I was planning. If you've never lived in a house where you are simultaneously essential and invisible, let me try to explain what it feels like. It feels like being the foundation of a building that everyone walks on without ever thinking about. You hold everything up. The meals, the schedules, the social calendar. The emotional temperature of every room, all of it runs through you, depends on you, would collapse without you. And yet you are not invited to the meetings where decisions are made. You are not consulted about the plans. You are thanked the way you thank a dishwasher, not with gratitude. Exactly, but with the mute expectation that you will continue to function. That was my life in the Whitmore house. Gerald was not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that. He was not the kind of man who raised his voice or broke things or made threats. His particular brand of diminishment was quieter and, in some ways, more corrosive than anything loud. He dismissed me the way you dismiss background noise, not with anger, but with a complete absence of attention. When I spoke at dinner, he would listen with the expression of a man waiting politely for a pause in the conversation so he could resume the actual conversation. When I had an opinion about a financial decision, he would nod and say, "I hear you, Sandra," and then proceed exactly as he had already planned. I had learned, over 31 years, not to push. Pushing lead to a particular look, patient, slightly weary. The look of a man who is managing a person who doesn't quite understand, and that look was worse than being ignored. Being ignored felt like weather. That look felt like a verdict. Eleanor was a different matter. Eleanor Whitmore was 81 years old, sharp as a letter opener, and had spent the better part of 5 decades perfecting the art of the pointed remark delivered with a sweet smile. She had grown up in what she called a real family, by which she meant a family with money, a family with standing, a family whose name meant something, and she had never quite forgiven Gerald for marrying a woman from a small town in Pennsylvania, whose father fixed cars. She didn't say this directly. Eleanor never said anything directly. She said things like, "Sandra, I'm sure you didn't know this, but in our family we always set the table this way," as though I were a foreign exchange student, still learning the customs. She said things like, "Gerald, do you remember that girl from the Henderson family?" I ran into her mother. She married so well, in a voice carefully calibrated to drift across the room and land exactly where she intended. She said things like, "I just think Sandra would be more comfortable if she didn't have to worry about things, like the investment accounts," to Gerald, in the kitchen, while I was standing 8 feet away in the hallway. I heard that one. I was meant to hear it, and Gerald, God help him, God help us both, said, "You're probably right, Mom. The investment accounts, this requires some explanation." When Gerald and I married, we had a joint account, the way young couples do. Over the years, as Gerald's career in finance advanced and the money grew more complicated, he had restructured things quietly, without much discussion, so that the primary accounts were in his name alone, with me listed as a beneficiary. "It's just cleaner this way," he'd explained, years ago, in a tone that foreclosed further conversation. "For tax purposes." I had a household account with a monthly allowance. That's not too strong a word, for it deposited by Gerald every first of the month. It covered groceries, household supplies, the children's school expenses when they were young. It was enough. It was, in fact, carefully calibrated to be exactly enough, with no surplus that might accumulate into anything resembling independence. I did not have a credit card in my own name until I was 43, and that had required a conversation that I still remember with a particular quality of shame, not because Gerald was awful about it, but because I had to ask, because it hadn't occurred to him to offer. When I look back now, I see it clearly. The financial architecture of our marriage had been designed, consciously or not, to ensure that leaving was difficult. Not impossible. I know women who have left with far less than I had, but difficult, complicated, dependent on Gerald's goodwill in ways that would have made any exit messy and uncertain. This is why my father's gift, sitting quietly in Pennsylvania in accounts Gerald didn't know existed, was not just money. It was a door. It was the knowledge that the walls around me had always had a door in them. I just hadn't known where to look. 3 months after my father's funeral, Eleanor moved in. It wasn't announced as a permanent arrangement. It was presented as temporary, just until we figure out the next steps, Gerald said, as though we had been consulted, as though we had agreed, following a minor fall she'd had in her condo. The fall was real, though the injury was minimal: a bruised hip. A bruised ego, more like, because Eleanor was the kind of woman who was more disturbed by evidence of physical limitation than by pain itself. She arrived on a Sunday in April, with 4 suitcases, a carload of specific items from her condo, her particular lamp, her particular throw blanket, her particular set of coffee cups that she preferred over mine, which she made clear by leaving mine on the counter in a small, neat pile, and an energy that I can only describe as expansionist. Within a week, she had opinions about every room in the house. Within 2 weeks, she had rearranged the pantry. Within a month, she was giving Gerald daily reports on what she felt needed to be done differently in the running of the household. And Gerald was listening to these reports at the dinner table while I sat across from him and thought about patience. About patience, and about the documents in Harold's office. And about my father's voice saying, "A man who makes you feel small is not a man who loves you." Patrick came home for a weekend in May. Patrick was 30 years old, working in marketing in Chicago. Recently engaged to a woman named Renee, who had perfect posture and an MBA and a way of looking around a room that suggested she was calculating its resale value. I liked Renee fine. I think she liked me fine. We occupied each other's lives in the careful, slightly formal way of women who are connected by circumstance rather than choice, and have decided, sensibly, to be pleasant about it. Patrick was, and I say this with the full weight of maternal love and maternal disappointment held simultaneously in my chest, his father's son. Not in temperament. Patrick was warmer than Gerald, easier to laugh with, more willing to exist in a moment without needing to control it. But in this particular architecture of not seeing, he had inherited something he probably didn't even know he'd been given. He didn't see me either. That weekend, I made 3 meals a day plus snacks. Laundered and folded Patrick's laundry because he'd mentioned offhandedly that he'd run out of clean shirts. Helped Renee with a work presentation she was finishing on her laptop at the kitchen table. And drove to 3 different grocery stores because Eleanor wanted a specific brand of crackers we didn't have. At no point did Patrick ask if I needed help with anything. At no point did it seem to occur to him that the constant material comfort surrounding him had an author. On Sunday morning, while I was making eggs, I heard him say to Gerald, "You guys are lucky, having Mom here to hold down the fort." Gerald made a sound that meant yes. I stood at the stove and held the spatula very tightly and thought, fort. They thought I was holding down a fort. I was the fort. Diane was different, and I want to honor that difference because it matters to this story. Diane was 26, living in Portland with her boyfriend Marcus, working as a physical therapist. She called me twice a week, not out of obligation, I don't think, but because she actually wanted to talk. She asked me real questions. How are you sleeping, Mom? What have you been reading? Did you ever look into that pottery class you mentioned? She was the only person in my immediate world who treated my interior life as a real thing that existed and mattered. When she heard that Eleanor had moved in, she was quiet for a moment and then said, very carefully, "How are you handling that, Mom?" "Really, I'm fine," I said. The reflex, Mom. Just my name, just one syllable, but loaded with the particular frequency of a child who has been watching her mother perform fine for 20 years and knows exactly what it sounds like. I took a breath. "It's an adjustment," I said. "You don't have to do this forever," Diane said. I didn't ask what she meant. I knew what she meant, and I filed it away with everything else I was filing away. In that quiet place inside me that was growing steadily less quiet. The summer brought a development I had not anticipated. Gerald's younger brother Carl came to visit in July. Carl was 53, twice divorced, currently between jobs in the specific way that meant he was waiting for someone else to fix his circumstances. He was charming in the effortless, careless way of people who have always been able to charm their way out of consequences. He drove an expensive car he couldn't afford and wore a watch that was meant to signal success and had a way of laughing at things that made you feel, briefly, like you were both in on the same joke, before you realized you were the joke. I had never trusted Carl. This was not a dramatic feeling. I had no evidence of anything specific against him, just an accumulation of small observations over 30 years. The way he borrowed things and returned them late or not at all. The way he talked about women, all women, including me, including Eleanor, with a particular brand of fond condescension, like we were amusing pets. The way he looked at money, not with desire, exactly, but with a sense of entitlement, as though wealth in his vicinity naturally belonged to him. Carl stayed for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Carl at the dinner table, telling stories that positioned him as the hero of every situation. 3 weeks of Carl and Gerald talking in Gerald's study with the door mostly closed. 3 weeks of Carl complimenting Eleanor's blouse and Eleanor softening visibly, predictably, in the way that a certain type of mother softens around the child she loves most, easily. Gerald had always been Eleanor's practical favorite, the responsible one, the successful one, the one who called on Sundays and came home for holidays. But Carl was her emotional favorite, the way second children sometimes are, or the charming ones, or the ones who make you feel most needed. When Carl looked at Eleanor with those warm eyes and said, "You're looking well, Mom," something in Eleanor's posture changed, something unlocked. I watched all of this and said nothing. But I noticed. And when Carl left, 3 weeks later, Gerald was quieter than usual, and Eleanor had started making phone calls in the evenings from her room, with the door closed, which she had not done before. Something was shifting. I could feel it the way you feel weather changing before the sky shows it. September came, and with it, a conversation I was not meant to hear. I want to be precise about this. I was not eavesdropping. I was in the kitchen, preparing the evening meal, and the kitchen in our house is separated from Gerald's study by a hallway that has an odd acoustic quality. I had noticed this years ago, had mentioned it to Gerald once, had suggested we have it looked at. Gerald had said I'll get to it and never had. I was slicing vegetables when I heard Eleanor's voice. Distinct and carrying. It simply makes more sense to do it this way. Gerald, Carl needs a foundation, and you have more than enough. Gerald's response was lower, harder to catch. I set down the knife. Not about need, he was saying. It's about structure. If we restructure the trust the way Harold, not Harold, the other one, Mercer, the way Mercer suggested, then the bulk transfers to Carl upon your. Eleanor's voice again, sharper. I am not talking about upon my anything. I'm talking about a gift, a significant gift. Now, while I can see the good it does. Silence. Sandra doesn't need to know the details, Eleanor said. Sandra doesn't need to be involved in any of this. I stood very still in the kitchen with a carrot in my hand. It's a family matter, Eleanor continued. And then, with perfect precision, a Whitmore family matter. I put the carrot down. I finished making dinner. I set the table. I called Gerald and Eleanor to eat, and sat across from them, and passed the bread and asked about Eleanor's day, and listened to Gerald talk about a client situation at work. I was, to all appearances, exactly who they believed me to be, Sandra, the woman at the stove. The woman who held down the fort, the woman who didn't need to know the details. After dinner, I washed the dishes. I dried them and put them away. Then I went to the bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. I was not angry, not in the hot, immediate way. I was something colder and more clarifying than anger. I was resolved. I picked up my phone and called Diane. "Hey, Mom," she said, warm and immediate. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said. And then, surprising myself, actually, no, I need to talk. There was a pause, a breath of surprise, quickly steadied. "I'm here," Diane said. "Tell me everything." I didn't tell her everything. Not yet, but I told her enough. I told her about the conversation I'd overheard, about Carl's visit and Eleanor's evening phone calls and the closed door of Gerald's study. About the pattern I'd been watching for months, years, really, if I was being honest, of being edged toward the outside of my own life. Diane listened without interrupting, which was one of her great gifts. When I finished, she said, "Mom, you need to talk to a lawyer." "I know," I said. "Your own lawyer." "Not Harold, I mean. Harold is fine, but I mean someone who specifically does divorce and asset law." I was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you're thinking?" Diane asked carefully. "Divorce?" I thought about the word. It sat in the room differently than I expected. Not devastating, not liberating. Exactly. Just real. A door that had always been in the wall, finally named. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "But I think I need to know what my options are." "Yes," Diane said firmly. "That's exactly right. You need to know what you have before you decide what to do with it." She said it just like that, and I thought, she sounds like my father. And that thought cracked something open in my chest that had been sealed for 4 years. The next day, I called Harold Finch. Harold was not surprised to hear from me. Harold, I think, had been waiting for this call in the way that a patient man waits for something inevitable. "Sandra," he said, "how are you holding up?" "I'm holding up fine," I said. "Harold, I need to know where everything stands. Specifically, I need to know what my father set up and whether any of it is accessible in a way that Gerald could find out about before I'm ready." A pause. The sound of Harold settling into his chair. "No," he said. "No, none of it is. Your father was extremely deliberate about that. The accounts are in your name, your social security number, structured specifically to ensure privacy. There is nothing in any joint filing or shared financial document that would reveal their existence. And the value, roughly, as of today." Harold gave me a number. The number had grown since our conversation 4 years ago. I wrote it down on a piece of paper and looked at it for a long time. Then I folded the paper and put it in my coat pocket and went to run an errand. And when I came back, Eleanor was in my kitchen reorganizing my spice cabinet and Gerald was watching football, and I set my purse down and thought, not yet, but soon. A week later, I made an appointment with a family law attorney. Her name was Patricia Okafor, and she had been recommended by a woman I knew from book club, quietly, carefully, in the way women recommend lawyers to each other when the situation is delicate. Patricia's office was in a building downtown that I had driven past hundreds of times without ever going in, and I sat in her clean, calm waiting room and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt like a person who was taking action. Patricia was 55, compact and precise, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the manner of someone who has heard everything and judges nothing. She listened to me for 40 minutes. She asked careful questions. She took notes. When I finished, she looked at me over her glasses and said, "You've been very patient." "Probably too patient," I said. "No," she said, with a particular firmness, "patient in a way that has protected you. You have a complete picture. You have documentation, history," and she tapped her notepad, "independent assets that your husband has no claim to, because they predate the marriage and were never commingled." "What does that mean, in practical terms?" I asked, though I had an idea. "It means that in a divorce proceeding, those assets are yours. Clearly, cleanly, entirely yours." She paused. "It also means that you have options that many women in your situation do not have. You can leave when you choose to leave, on your terms, without financial vulnerability." I nodded slowly. "I want to understand the full picture," I said. "Before I decide anything, I want to understand what happens to the marital assets, what Gerald would be entitled to, what I would be entitled to, and I want to understand what happens if he and his mother restructure the family trust to benefit Carl before I've made any move." Patricia nodded. "That's exactly the right sequence of questions," she said. "Let's go through them one by one." I left Patricia's office 2 hours later with a folder of my own, not as thick as Harold's, but growing. I drove home through the ordinary suburban landscape, the gas stations and the grocery stores and the chain restaurants and the neighborhoods of houses exactly like mine, and I thought about my father, about the way he had spent 30 years building something in silence, not from secrecy exactly, but from the understanding that certain things need to be protected until they're ready. That announcing your plans before you're positioned to act on them is a way of ensuring they don't succeed. My father had been protecting me for 30 years. It was time to start protecting myself. October arrived with cool air and a new development. Carl was back. This time, he didn't stay in the guest room. He stayed in the finished basement, which had a separate entrance and a small bathroom, and which I had, over the years, furnished and arranged into a pleasant space, because I had thought, vaguely, that it might be nice for guests, or eventually for Diane if she ever moved back to Ohio. Instead, it was Carl's now, apparently. With his expensive suitcases and his watch and his way of moving through my house like it was already his. Gerald told me this as a fact, not a question. Carl's going to stay here for a while, he said one morning. Just while he gets things sorted. I said, how long is a while? Gerald looked at me with the patient, slightly weary look. Sandra, he's family, I said. I know he's family. Gerald, I asked how long. A pause, the look deepening. A few months, probably, maybe through the holidays. I nodded. I put my coffee cup in the sink. Okay, I said. I was very calm. On the inside of the calm, something was taking notes. With Carl in the house, the dynamic shifted in ways that were instructive. Carl and Eleanor were thick as thieves from the first morning, drinking coffee together in the kitchen before Gerald came downstairs, talking in low voices that stopped when I walked in. This was not subtle. Eleanor had never been a subtle woman. Her sharpness had always been on display, a quality she seemed to consider a virtue. But there was something about this particular closeness, this particular secretiveness, that felt different from her usual management of the household. It felt purposeful. I kept my routine. I cooked the meals and ran the errands and smiled at the appropriate moments. I was, to all appearances, exactly as I had always been, accommodating, undemanding, easy to overlook. But I was also, 3 days a week while Gerald was at work and Eleanor and Carl were doing whatever they were doing. Sitting in my car in the parking lot of a library 2 miles from my house, using the free Wi-Fi on my phone, having phone calls with Patricia Okafor. Patricia and I talked about Ohio divorce law, about asset protection, about the specific mechanics of what would happen to the marital home, about Gerald's pension and his investment accounts, and what a judge would likely find equitable given the length of the marriage and my contributions to the household. We talked about timing and documentation. We talked about the importance of not making any financial moves that would signal to Gerald that something was changing. You're in a strong position, Patricia told me regularly. Don't give that up by acting before you're ready. I was not going to act before I was ready. In November, I learned what Carl and Eleanor were actually planning. This time, I didn't overhear a conversation. This time, it came to me through Diane, who had driven up from Portland for Thanksgiving. A visit I was extraordinarily grateful for, and through the particular way that information travels in families when people assume the wrong person isn't paying attention. It was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Gerald and Carl had gone to the hardware store, leaving Eleanor and Diane and me in the kitchen, doing prep work for the next day's meal. Eleanor was in an expansive mood. I had noticed this before. The way she became almost voluble when she was happy about something, when something was going according to plan. She was talking about the future, about family legacy, about the importance of keeping things in the right hands. Diane, who had not seen Eleanor in 6 months, and was assessing the landscape with fresh eyes, was listening with a careful expression I recognized, my daughter's listening face. The house of course will be Gerald's, and then Patrick's eventually, Eleanor was saying serenely while peeling potatoes. That's how it should be. It's a Whitmore house. I was at the counter, not looking at either of them, and Carl, Eleanor continued, will be taken care of through the trust restructuring. Harold, the new one, Mercer, he's been very helpful. Once the paperwork is finalized, Carl will have what he needs to start fresh. Diane said, carefully, that's a significant gift. It's not a gift, Eleanor said, with a slight edge. It's a legacy. It's family, taking care of family. I set down my knife. And Mom, Diane said. Just like that. Where does Mom fit into the legacy? A pause, a beat too long. Sandra is well taken care of, Eleanor said smoothly. Gerald provides very well. I didn't ask about Gerald, Diane said. I asked about Mom. The air in the kitchen changed quality. Eleanor looked at Diane for a moment with those sharp eyes. Then she looked at me, and this was the thing. This was the moment I will remember. She looked at me with an expression of complete, serene confidence. The expression of a woman who has assessed the situation and found nothing threatening. Sandra understands how things work, Eleanor said. She turned back to her potatoes. I picked up my knife and continued chopping. But across the kitchen, Diane was looking at me. And the look on her face was not acceptance. It was not resignation. It was something that looked like the beginning of a plan. That night, after dinner, Diane knocked on my bedroom door. She sat on the edge of the bed across from me and said, without preamble, Mom, what is going on? And I want the real answer, not the fine answer. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. She was 26 years old, this person I had made, and she had her grandmother Robert's eyes, that same quality of steady, unhurried attention. She was looking at me the way he used to look at me. Like what I said mattered. Like she would wait as long as it took. I took a breath, and I told her everything. I told her about the conversation I'd overheard in September. About Carl moving in. About the trust restructuring that was apparently already in progress with this lawyer Mercer. I told her about my calls with Patricia. I told her about Harold and the accounts and what my father had left me. I told her the number. Diane was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Grandpa. Just that. Just his name. With a weight of love and grief and understanding. He knew, I said. I think he always knew. He wanted to make sure I had something. Something that was mine. Diane wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the quick, practical gesture of a woman who feels things fully, but has somewhere to be. Then she looked at me with an expression that was part grief and part something else, something bright and fierce and determined. Okay, she said. What do we need to do? December was when things began to move. I want to be careful how I describe this, because I am not a woman who takes pleasure in conflict, and what happened over those weeks was not a pleasure. It was necessary. It was, in some ways, painful, but it was also, underneath all of that, clarifying in the way that only very honest things can be clarifying. When you stop performing, when you stop managing other people's comfort at the expense of your own survival, there is a quality of air in the room that changes. It's like opening a window that has been painted shut for 30 years. Patricia had given me a framework. Harold had given me documentation. Diane had given me the irreplaceable thing that no lawyer or accountant can provide. The steady presence of someone who believes that what is happening to you is real and matters and deserves to be addressed. My first move was quiet. They all were, at first. I opened a checking account at a bank across town, not the bank Gerald and I had used for years, a different institution entirely, in my name only. Into this account, I began moving small amounts from the household allowance, not enough to be noticed in any single month, but accumulating. This was not theft. The law and Patricia had been clear about this. It was prudent preparation. The kind of thing any reasonable person does when they are contemplating a significant life change. I was simply ensuring that I would not find myself, in the critical weeks of any transition, dependent on Gerald's goodwill for my daily needs. Harold had, at my direction, already ensured that the inheritance accounts were fully separated from anything Gerald could access or monitor. This had been true from the beginning, by my father's design. But I had Harold do an additional review, an additional confirmation, so that there were no loose threads, no overlooked points of access. Patricia had begun preparing documents. And I continued making dinner. The second move came in early December, and it was the one that required the most from me. I called Patrick. Patrick and I had a relationship that was warm in the superficial sense. He called on holidays. He came home for Christmas. He remembered my birthday, but then in the substantive sense. We had never had a conversation, as adults, that went past the surface of things. I had accepted this as the shape of our connection, without ever really examining whether it had to be that way. I asked him to meet me for lunch, alone, when he was back in Ohio for the holidays. He said yes, with the slight surprise of a person receiving an unusual invitation. We met at a restaurant. I chose neutral ground, not the house, and I ordered a glass of wine, which I rarely did at lunch, and looked at my son, across the table, and thought about how to begin. I want to talk to you about some family things, I said, and I want you to hear me out before you respond. Patrick put down his menu. Something in my voice had gotten his attention. Okay, he said. I told him, carefully and without drama, what I had overheard in September, what I knew about the trust restructuring, what Eleanor had said in the kitchen at Thanksgiving. And then I told him, watching his face, watching the discomfort flicker across it, and then settle into something more complicated than I was, considering making significant changes in my own life, and that I wanted him to hear about it from me, directly, before anything happened. Patrick was quiet for a long moment. Are you talking about leaving Dad? He asked. I'm talking about making sure my future is protected, I said carefully. Whatever that looks like. Mole, Patrick. I said his name the way I had said it when he was small and running towards something dangerous. I have been in that house for 31 years. I have given everything I have to that family. And the people in that house have spent the last year making plans, significant financial plans that I am explicitly excluded from. Your grandmother said, in front of me, that I don't need to know the details. That's not a marriage. I stopped. Found my voice again. I am not a piece of furniture, and I will not be treated like one. Patrick looked at me for a long time. His father's jaw, but something else in his eyes, something that was working to see me. Really see me, possibly for the first time. I didn't know, he said finally. I know you didn't, I said. And I meant it without bitterness. That's partly why I'm telling you now. We talked for 2 more hours. It was the longest real conversation Patrick and I had ever had. It was painful in places, and honest in ways that were uncomfortable for both of us. And by the end of it, something had shifted between us, not fixed, not resolved, but cracked open in a way that felt like the beginning of something real. He paid for lunch. Walking to our cars, he said, "What do you need, Mom? What can I do?" "Nothing yet," I said. "Just, no. That's all I need right now." He nodded. He hugged me, which he didn't usually do, and it was a real hug, not a polite one. I cried in my car for about 5 minutes. Then I drove home and made dinner. Christmas week arrived, and with it the convergence of everyone, Patrick and Renee in from Chicago. Diane up from Portland. Carl emerged from the basement in seasonal good spirits. Eleanor in her best blouse, and Gerald in his holiday hosting mode, expansive, generous, the version of himself he performed for occasions. It was a full house. I cooked for 3 days. I decorated. I wrapped gifts and organized the logistics of 4 adults plus in-laws plus a holiday schedule with the same competence I brought to everything. I was, to all appearances, the woman at the center of the house, the one who made it function and made it beautiful. But this Christmas was different from every other Christmas. Because this Christmas I knew it was probably the last one I would spend in this configuration. And that knowledge gave everything a quality of heightened clarity, the particular focus you get when you know you are looking at something for the last time and want to see it completely, want to understand exactly what it was and what it meant. What it meant was, I had given this family the best years of my life, and the best years had been genuinely good, in many ways. Gerald and I had built something real, had raised 2 children, had shared 31 years of an ordinary life that contained real moments of love and connection. I did not want to pretend otherwise. The marriage had not been a performance or a prison from the beginning. It had become something diminishing. something that had erased me incrementally over years. And that diminishment was real and worth addressing, but it had not always been this. And the loss of what it had been was a grief I was allowing myself to feel even as I moved toward something new. After Christmas dinner, while everyone was in the living room, I stood in the kitchen alone, washing the good china that couldn't go in the dishwasher. Through the doorway I could hear Gerald's voice, and Patrick's, and Carl's laugh, and Eleanor saying something to Renee about something. Diane came in. She picked up a dish towel without being asked, and began drying. For a minute we just worked together in comfortable silence. Then she said, quietly, "When?" "January," I said. She nodded. "I'll be here. You don't have to be." "Mom," she gave me the look. "I'll be here." I handed her a plate. "Thank you," I said. And we dried the rest of the dishes together in silence, the way women do. The way women always have, accomplishing the ordinary work that holds the world together, preparing, in their quiet and capable way, for what comes next. January came the way January always does in Ohio, gray and cold and uncompromising. The week after New Year's, Gerald went back to work. Patrick and Renee returned to Chicago. Carl retreated to the basement. Diane, true to her word, arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with a bag and a calm that steadied me more than anything else could have, and sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee while I moved through the house with a different quality of attention, noticing things, assessing, thinking about what I wanted and what I would leave and what I would ask for. Patricia had the papers ready. Harold had confirmed that everything on his end was in order. I had a meeting scheduled with Patricia at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. I did not sleep well Wednesday night. I lay in bed beside Gerald, this man I had slept beside for 31 years, whose breathing I knew as well as my own, whose habits and preferences and disappointments I could recite without thinking, and I thought about my father, about the flannel shirts and the old truck and the quiet certainty, about what he would say to me if he could. I thought he would say, "You already know what to do. You've always known. You were just waiting until you were ready." I was ready. Thursday morning, I got up before Gerald and made coffee. I set a cup on his side of the counter, the way I had every morning for 31 years. Then I sat at the kitchen table and waited. Gerald came downstairs at 7, surprised to find me already up and dressed. "You're up early," he said. "I have a meeting," I said. He picked up his coffee. "What kind of meeting?" I looked at him across the kitchen, this familiar, diminishing man, this person I had loved and been worn down by, and was now of clarity and sadness and something that felt almost like compassion, leaving. "I'll explain tonight," I said. He frowned slightly, the beginning of a question, but I had already picked up my purse and my keys. "Sandra, there's oatmeal on the stove," I said. "I'll be back this afternoon." I walked out the front door. The meeting with Patricia took 3 hours. I signed documents. I reviewed disclosures. I answered questions in a voice that was steady because I had spent months preparing for this. Because I knew exactly what I had and what I wanted and what I was willing to negotiate. Patricia was thorough and calm and treated me throughout as a capable adult who had made a considered decision, which is exactly what I needed and exactly what I had so rarely received. When we were done, she shook my hand and said, "You're going to be all right, Sandra." "I know," I said, and I meant it. Gerald was served that evening. I want to describe what happened in that house over the next weeks carefully, because I don't want to turn it into something dramatic that it wasn't. Life is not a television show. People do not collapse or confess or have operatic moments of recognition. What actually happens, usually, is quieter and more complicated and sadder and also, in its own way, more real. Gerald's first reaction was shock, genuine, unperformed shock. The look of a man who has lived in such certainty of a particular reality that its dissolution registers as something almost physical. He sat in the living room with the papers in his hands and looked at me as though he was seeing me for the first time, which, in some important sense, he was. "You have a lawyer," he said. as though that were the most incomprehensible part. I have had a lawyer for several months, I said. But the finances, he looked up. The filing says you have independent assets. Yes, I said. I do. He stared at me. The patient, slightly weary look was gone. In its place was something I had not seen on his face in many years. Real attention. How? He said. My father left them to me, I said. 4 years ago. I kept it private, on his advice and my own judgment. A long pause. Gerald set down the papers. For years, he said. For years, I confirmed. He was silent. And in the silence, I watched something complicated move across his face. Not just surprise, not just the beginning of defensive calculation, but something deeper, something that looked like recognition, like a man understanding, for the first time, what he had not been paying attention to. Sandra, he said. I didn't. He stopped. I know, I said. That's the problem, Gerald, you didn't. Eleanor's reaction was different. I had anticipated anger. What I got instead was something more unsettling, a long, cool look, the kind she reserved for things that had confounded her expectations. She came to find me the morning after Gerald was served, in the kitchen, where I was where else, making breakfast. She stood in the doorway in her lavender blouse and looked at me for a long moment. So, she said finally. Good morning, Eleanor, I said. You had money, she said. All this time. Yes, I said. Another pause. Your father. Yes. Eleanor was quiet. I turned back to the stove. I underestimated you, she said. Her voice had a quality I had never heard in it before, something that wasn't quite respect, but was adjacent to it. Something that acknowledged, however reluctantly, that she had misread the situation. Misread me. Most people did, I said pleasantly. I put a plate of toast on the counter and went to the table. The weeks that followed were not easy, and I will not pretend they were. Divorce proceedings, even when one party is financially secure and emotionally prepared, are exhausting and administrative and punctuated by moments of unexpected grief. There were evenings when I sat in the house that was being legally reconfigured around me and felt the full weight of 31 years, not just the bad parts, but the ordinary parts, the Tuesday mornings and the family Christmases and the way Gerald's hand had felt in mine at Patrick's first school concert. But there were also mornings when I woke up and felt, with startling and unprecedented clarity, that the life ahead of me was completely and entirely mine to shape. That no one would tell me my opinions were unnecessary. That no one would move my spice cabinet. That the money in those accounts, my father's gift, my inheritance, the quiet legacy of a man who had spent 30 years making sure his daughter had options, was mine, absolutely mine, in a way that nothing in my adult life had been entirely mine before. The marital settlement was reached in March. Given the length of the marriage, my contributions to the household, and the straightforward financial picture Patricia had built over our months of preparation, the outcome was fair. A portion of the marital assets, a clean separation of Gerald's finances from mine, and the house which Gerald wanted to keep, which I did not want to fight for, settled with an offsetting buyout that left me with a lump sum. Combined with my inheritance, I was, at 58 years old, financially independent in a way I had never been in my adult life. I found an apartment, small, by the standards of the house I'd lived in for decades, but full of light, 2 windows in the living room that faced east, so that the mornings came in gold and clear and completely my own. I painted the walls a soft blue that Eleanor would have hated. I arranged the furniture exactly as I wanted it. I put my books on a shelf in the order I preferred and my dishes in the cabinet where they made sense to me and my spices. God help me wherever I pleased. Carl and the trust restructuring, as it turned out, did not proceed as planned. This was not entirely my doing. But it was partially my doing, because in the legal process of the divorce, The full picture of the marital finances was disclosed in ways that made certain of Gerald's unilateral plans, including the arrangements he had been making with Eleanor and Mercer about the trust subjects of formal legal scrutiny. Gerald's lawyer advised him, in the middle of the proceedings, that transferring significant assets to Carl while a divorce was pending was not a strategy anyone would recommend. Carl did not get his significant gift. Not then, not in the way that had been planned. Carl moved out of the basement in February. I heard this from Diane, who heard it from Patrick, who told her in the tone of a man piecing together a picture that had previously been obscured. Patrick, to his credit, had been doing a lot of that piecing together the picture, sitting with what he found. He called me more regularly now. The conversations were real in a way they hadn't been before. I didn't see it, he told me one evening, in March, his voice carrying the specific gravity of adult accountability. I saw everything that was convenient, and I didn't ask about the rest. I'm sorry, Mom. I know you are, I said. That matters. What can I do? He asked. Going forward, what can I actually do? I thought about it. Show up, I said. Really show up, not just for holidays. Not just when it's convenient. That's all I've ever wanted from you. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I can do that. Good, I said. Then we'll be okay. Diane flew in the weekend. I moved into the apartment. She helped me carry boxes and hang curtains and figure out where the couch looked best, and argue cheerfully about whether the bookshelf should go by the window or on the opposite wall. We ate pizza on the floor of the half-unpacked living room and drank wine, and she made me laugh 3 times in an hour. Real laughing. The kind that starts in the stomach. The kind I hadn't done enough of in years. At one point she stopped in the middle of eating her pizza and looked around the apartment. The soft blue walls, the eastern windows, the books on the shelf in my order, and said, "This feels like you." I looked around too. "Yes," I said, "it does." She raised her glass. "To Grandpa," she said. I raised mine. "To Grandpa." We drank. Outside the window, the March sky was doing that thing it does sometimes in the transition between winter and spring, not warm yet, not really, but with a quality of light that suggests the possibility of warmth, a sky that is gathering itself, getting ready. I sat on the floor of my apartment and felt it. The specific and remarkable sensation of a life that belongs entirely to you. Not perfect. Not without grief or complication or the ordinary. Difficulties that don't resolve just because you've resolved the larger ones, but mine. Authentically, completely, finally, mine. My father had given me that. Not the money, or not just the money. He had given me the understanding that a door exists even when you can't see it. That patience is not the same as surrender. That the most powerful thing a person can do is know their own worth and weight, with stillness and certainty, for the moment when the knowing becomes action. I had been that woman at the stove for 31 years. I had been the woman who wiped the baseboards and set the table and held her tongue and made herself easy to overlook. I was done being overlooked. It is May now. For months since I signed the papers. 2 months since I moved into the apartment with the eastern windows. I have a routine that is entirely my own. I wake without an alarm, because no one needs breakfast at 7:15 anymore. I make coffee the way I like it, strong, with a little cardamom, a habit I picked up from a cookbook I bought on a whim, because no one was there to have an opinion about it. I sit by the window and watch the morning come in, and sometimes I read, and sometimes I just sit. Which I am learning is a thing I am allowed to do. I have started the pottery class I mentioned to Diane over a year ago and never followed through on. The instructor is a woman named June who is 63 and irreverent and funny, and who told me, my first day, that the most important thing about clay is that it requires your complete attention or it will do whatever it wants. I thought about that for a long time after class. I think it applies to more than clay. I have lunch with Patricia once a month now, not as my attorney, though she's still technically available in that capacity. As a friend, as a person who treated me like a capable adult, at a time when I needed exactly that, and whom I found, over months of working together, to be someone I wanted to know. I speak to Patrick every Sunday, at noon, without fail. It was his idea. He called me the first Sunday after I moved in and said, "Is this okay? I want to make it a regular thing." And I thought of my father, who had called me every Sunday for 31 years, who had waited patiently on the other end of the phone and asked, "You doing okay, Sandra?" And I said yes, it was more than okay, and we talked for an hour about nothing much and everything important, and it was the beginning of something I think will hold. Eleanor, I am told, moved back to her condo in February. Gerald is still in the house. Carl is somewhere. I don't think about Carl very much. I don't think about Eleanor very much either, which is perhaps the most surprising and satisfying part of all of this. That the person who occupied so much space in my thoughts for so many years has simply become quiet. A memory, a chapter that is over. Gerald, I think about sometimes, in the way you think about a place you lived for a long time. With recognition and complexity, and a sadness that is not regret but something more honest than regret, the acknowledgement that two people can fail each other without either of them being a villain. That a life can be real and worth living and also wrong for you. That leaving something doesn't mean it was nothing. He called me once, in February. I don't know what he expected. What he said, after a long and slightly painful pause, was, "I didn't know you were unhappy." I thought about that for a moment. "I know," I said. "That was part of the problem." He was quiet. Are you okay?" he asked. And the question was genuine, I think. Clumsy, insufficient, 30 years late, but genuine. "I'm very okay," I said. And I meant it more completely than I had meant anything in a long time. I think about my father often, here in the apartment with the eastern windows. I think about what he built, and why he built it, and what he understood, in his quiet, unhurried way, about the nature of things. He never told me what to do. That was never his style. He gave me resources and trusted me to know when to use them. He gave me patience by example. He gave me, without naming it, the understanding that your worth is not determined by whether the people around you see it. That being overlooked is a condition, not a verdict. That a woman who knows what she has and waits for the right moment is not passive, she is precise. I was precise. And standing at the window of my apartment on a May morning, with the sun coming in golden clean, with my coffee just right and my books in my order and my days unfolding in a shape I recognize as my own, I understand something I want to say clearly and without apology. I was never the maid. I was never the fort, or the furniture, or the background noise, or the woman who just needed to know how things work. I was always the one holding the door. I just had to decide to walk through it. And I did. Sandra,